As we wrap up our series, Living with La Soufriere, we hear from those integrally involved in managing the disaster about the lessons learned. For Director of the National Emergency Management Organization, Michelle Forbes, one of the key lessons learned is about the investment in the science.
We have to boost the scientific capacity within the Soufriere monitoring unit and the observation of the volcano itself. We are spending over $1 million in upgrading our network, and we're making more of a national network now. We have to have instruments on the volcano, we have to have instruments at different points throughout the country, and we're expanding it to the Grenadines now because we have Kikim Jenny not too far off. So we are now increasing to a more national monitoring network. We include both for earthquakes and tsunamis. So that's one of the lessons learned, so we can expand. But the lessons learned is that we must have that science at all times guiding us.
Despite what continues to be heralded as life-saving work by the University of the West Indies Seismic Research Centre 1 year ago, the work of the centre is being hamstrung by dire financial constraints. This is the lament of lead scientist during the eruptions and past director of the Seismic Research Centre, Professor Richard Robertson, who warned that the inability of the facility to complete critical research has left the region exposed to the vagaries of future events of this magnitude.
When the eruption was happening, we had a lot of attention. There was a lot of goodwill. I think there's still a lot of goodwill out there. But to be frank, I haven't seen it translated in any practical manner. As I speak to you now, from what I understand in terms of our funding, from speaking to the director, and I speak to her all the time, we are in dire straits. We are barely covering the cost of staffing, which means that operationally, because staffing is one thing, but then you have to run the equipment, you have to buy equipment, you have to move people up and down the islands. We operate in a space in the earth that extends for about 750 kilometers. All the way we monitor volcanoes and earthquakes and assist with tsunamis, all the way up from north, as far north as Antigua, Barbados, all the way down to Trinidad and Tobago. We're responsible, you mentioned volcanoes, 19 live volcanoes in the region, and we're responsible for a lot of them. But yet, and the governments constantly, the governments say we're doing a good job. You said that you just said that the world, the region thinks we did a good job. But we don't see that translated, practically into practical cash on hand. So currently we have a number of governments, as far as I'm aware, that is owing the University of West Indies for years for contributions. And our contributions, I can tell you frankly, our budget, we are in Trinidad, and I think our budget is supposed to be something like 12 million TT dollars. On any 1 year, we would get about close to half of that, probably about 7 million if we're lucky, and that's where we're running on now. So after a year of all of that, I'm telling you that we are in serious trouble. I don't know what else it would require to change the needle. I don't understand. I think everybody in the region, people at the common level, everybody thinks it's needed. You just said it's needed. I think if things don't change soon, what we will have to do, frankly, in my opinion, I'm not the director, but I suggested that we have to go and try GoFundMe. We'll have to ask people out there, can you fund us? Because we're running on fumes right now. And we're running on fumes a year after we have successfully monitored and managed a critical crisis that affected not only St Vincent and Grenadines, but Barbados and a number of other territories because of the ash problem. We successfully did it. We've proved ourselves, as you correctly said. But we don't see the money coming in as a result at all, despite all the goodwill. I'm sorry. It's really hard. I mean, for me as a professional in the field, is terrible.
Meanwhile, Member of Parliament for North Leeward, Carlos James, said he was concerned by the ease at which communities in the north of the island could be cut off during a disaster because of the existence of a single road in and out.
We have noted that, and even prior to the eruption, we put in place the reconstruction of the Chateaubriand Wharf, which is one of the main ports of entry on the North Leeward side. We have done some rehabilitation to a bypass road called Long Line between Colville and Trumuka,
right,
which is a bit more of a flatter area as opposed to going down into the valleys that a lot of the hillsides, as you will know from the terrain.
Right.
So we have put a number of different measures in place in terms of an evacuation exercise. How do we get people out? And it was effective during the eruption. Majority of the persons who evacuated North Leeward left by sea.
Right.
We had about 4 or 5 commercial ferries, and I want to again publicly commend the ferry operators, those in the Grenadines, Beckway, and even Southern Grenadines, who lend their support to us here in North Leeward. So we had an evacuation exercise by sea, which was successful. But of course, because of the terrain, it doesn't allow for a lot of emergency evacuations and so on out of North Leeward. So we tend to use a lot of the services by sea.
Okay.
And it has been proven to be a success during the recent eruption of the La Soufriere.
Okay. The way houses are constructed are also likely to change going forward. Oswald Hooper, who is responsible for overseeing the repair of homes in North Leeward that were damaged by the eruption, told Nation News that roofs are being rebuilt with steeper profiles to prevent settling of ash in the event of future eruption. Has there been any tweaks to the construction process I mean, obviously you can't build total resilience for a volcano, but has there been any tweaks to the construction methodology in St Vincent that would offer persons, I don't know, more steeper roofs so that ash could roll off? I don't know. I'm no construction expert by any stretch of the imagination, but what can you tell me along that line?
I think all in all, there has been a lot of improvement because the government came with their own criteria. Because there has been a lot of old buildings. If you go around and you could see a lot of the building that's basically was damaged. They didn't have the type of enforcement that they should have had from the beginning. So those were some of the buildings that actually suffered. Buildings that was there for like 30, 40, 50 years now and never actually had the type of strength in terms of the construction, upgrade of the construction technology as we move forward. So those are some of the buildings that's primarily, most of those buildings has been damaged. But in terms of the government, in terms of how they're moving forward, yes, we are doing as much because we're actually raising the profile of most of the roof them that we're dealing with, like you just said. So if there is ever another time wherever the volcano erupt, whether tomorrow or another 20, 50 years from now, we will not have the same issues in terms of ashes settling on the roof and just being there whereby people's house roof has been collapsing over and over.
Finally, Professor Robertson contends that serious thought must be put into land use close to the volcano, warning against the development of any critical infrastructure in that zone.
There's a couple of things. I mentioned that in terms of volcanoes, certainly what the eruptions and what the activity tells us is that is something we have to factor in the equation when we look at sustainable development. And the short-term way of doing that is to make sure that we have monitoring, research, procedures and plans for managing the eruption. But there's a long-term aspect to it, which has to do with long-term planning, and it has to do with land use, it has to do with planning and things like that. So when we look at the spaces that volcanoes occupy, we need to think about how we utilize those spaces to minimize the vulnerability that the populations might be exposed to. So that might mean that in some of those areas around volcanoes, we have to reduce the amount of investment in, well, not so much the amount of investment, but we have to reduce the kinds of investment and the kinds of things that we put there, whatever infrastructure. You know, for example, you don't put your critical hospital on the side of a volcanic mountain because, you know, at some point in the future it might get mashed up. So you need to think of using the spaces in a long-term view, in the view that within less than, in the case of Soufriere now, within the next 50 to 60 years, you could have another eruption. So look at, if you think of St Vincent, look at what happens with those spaces. Now, in some cases, like in St Vincent, you have established populations there that have a long history. Some of the people there are not going to want to move. So it means that you have to cater for, if people are going to live there, you have to cater how are they going to live more safely. So in the case of, again, St Vincent, it means that you have to get people out of the river valleys, which would make them exposed to lahars, which will continue even after the eruption. It has to make sure that if people are building new structures, new buildings, the buildings have to be built such that the roofs could withstand some amount of ash. So when the eruption happens, the buildings don't collapse. It means that the people have to be a lot more aware and involved in looking at the mountain, not being scared of the mountain, perhaps get the people themselves involved in becoming more engaged with the changing landscapes. And we're trying to do that in St. Vincent in terms of becoming more part of the monitoring network and more seeing this volcano as their own and looking at it in a way in which how can they live safely with it? They know that at some point they might have to move up the mountain, but even in between, can they help us to detect signs that something is unusual? Can they help us to monitor, essentially, become what we call citizen scientists? This whole community approach, we have to engage the community more in terms of those who live in vulnerable areas that would not want to move. But from a long-term perspective from government, it means also that governments have to not put the critical infrastructure. If they have them there, and I could speak to places like Dominica. Dominica's capital, Roseau, is on the side of one of the mountains that could erupt. So Dominica, in their long-term plan, I have to think about, suppose the volcanoes in the south of Dominica start to erupt. What plans do we have to transfer things to the next side? You can't wait until the eruption starts. You have to have long-term, you have to have a long-term perspective, medium-term as well as short-term, to how to deal with the volcanic hazard. The thing that the volcanoes show us is that they can erupt, and when they erupt, they can be extremely disruptive. At this present time, I think if we have a monitoring system in place, if we have the processes in place like we have at Seismic, through Seismic, if you found an agency like Seismic, if they do the job properly, nobody should be killed. But then the other thing that we can't stop, and that's is the destruction, which is the livelihoods part. And there's as something that we have to look at more in terms of a long-term view. How do you deal with the livelihoods? If people have to move off the mountain, what happens to the animals? What happens to their farming? Is the alternative farming lands? That's a long. I think the territories that have volcanoes have volcanoes that can erupt, and we have identified them. We have a volcanic hazard that lasts. No island territory could say they don't know that have a live volcano that could erupt. So you know that. So what do you do in terms of long-term planning, as well as making sure you have the investment in short-term in agencies like Seismic, in terms of your own disaster preparedness, to make sure that you can deal with the short-term aspect of it.
This brings us to the end of the series Living with La Soufriere. We want to thank our viewers for taking the time to join us during these 5 episodes. We hope that you have gained some insight into life 1 year after the eruption in St Vincent and the Grenadines. We witness a country still grappling with some of the challenges in the aftermath, but most striking is the significant progress made possible through the resilience and determination of the people. This is multimedia journalist Colville Mounsey and photojournalist Shanice King, signing out until next time.